下靠谱了，高点，上来。
Sława, dzień dobry, and hello. What I would like to discuss today in this episode of Free Falling is the concept of how these revolutions tend to start and generally what we perceive as expression, how expression is formed, how thought is changed, and what actually keeps thought, how thought is transmitted most effectively in society. The right seems to work under the paradigm that we transfer thought via rational discussion. However, we also acknowledge that most people are not rational in the slightest. This is an interesting sort of dichotomy. In a way, it's its own dissonance within the right, where we think that we have the optimal answer, where we essentially say, yes, we will have rational discussion and we will convince people. Well, it may convince some people, namely people that are on the fence and that have been thinking about essentially shopping for a new set of ideas, or that are relatively open-minded people. This really is never the case, and this is something that Pascal noted early on, that you must speak to the heart. Essentially is what part of his message was, is that essentially you can convince someone through the heart far more consistently than you can convince someone through the mind. And in a way, this is explained by the fact that man is, to some degree, his own slave to his own passions. But this is not to be discouraging, but the right has a serious issue with speaking to the heart. However, what we can note is how the left has begun their own little revolution, and how certain things work on our psyches. For example, any of you that have done martial arts or that have been put in a uniform know that the moment the uniform hits your shoulders, the moment you strap on those pants or those gloves or whatever you need to be in uniform, your mentality changes. The things you're willing to do change. Of course, you will be trained to execute these more efficiently and more consequentially, but just the fact that you have, say, a gi on, and you hit the judo mat, you're willing to pound people into that mat right from the start. Your inhibitions are gone. And this has to do with the fact that not only is the whole atmosphere different, you have mats, you have your partners and all of that, and you're all there to some degree agreeing to fight or beat the absolute crap out of each other if necessary, if that is what your training requires. However, it does not change the fact that by putting on the gi, you are actually changing your mentality. Because by putting on the gi, you have accepted everything that comes with putting on the gi. And this also means the things you will be doing to others and that others will be doing to you. It brings you into a whole different dichotomy. Same happens when you put on a police uniform, a doctor's outfit, a surgeon's scrub. You go into the surgical room, you put on scrubs, you get those gloves, everything changes. You are now someone different, you are doing something different. What ends up happening thus is that because it seems that clothing is able to convey to others what our intention is, what our ideas are, and what we are capable of doing or not doing, then it stands to reason that if you change the way you dress, you will also change the way you act. And thusly, you will change the way you think, and you will also change the way you are received by others. Of course, this can beget hostility. But, in general, it seems to be let on by the wayside. For example, I won't use the example here. I'll put it at the end of the video because that's where I'll try to explain what I'm getting at with all of this. What else we see is that symbols tend to also be very important in this. We see essentially that symbols, that certain values and certain ideas are usually sold or marketed through symbols to a wider audience. And people find that symbols, even though they don't necessarily know what they mean, and all of they can't list out the values from A to Z that this symbol represents. However, they get the general gist of it through the symbol, and the symbol thusly begins to represent something much wider and greater. And it is much easier to adopt a symbol than it is to adopt points A through Z, because then you have to go through the whole rationalization process. Instead, you adopt the symbol and you adopt the vague idea of what is right and wrong based around that symbol. A perfect example is Polska Walcząca, that the Warsaw Uprising saw made popular. It was the symbol of Polish resistance against German occupation, and thusly became a symbol of Polish pride, to some degree Polish nationalism even, but it's mostly a symbol of patriotism. Then again, patriotism politically is nationalism, so I guess you could use these interchangeably. However, the symbol itself has been even adopted, well, it's really mostly marred by the left. The left seeks to destroy it. And what ends up happening is we have these clashes and conflicts around these symbols and what should be allowed and what should not be. The left has been trying to classify these symbols, the phalange, etc., as these horrible fascist symbols that are and they've been trying to get them to legalize. So essentially, if it would be returning to a state of of wartime Poland, where we're in German occupation, except that this time we have the liberal lefty homo boy Gestapo going around. Gestapo. Hey. But what is important to realize is that all of these things are marketed via symbols. They're spread, they're disseminated through symbols, because symbols essentially embody the general, just the emotional power of what we're talking about when we're speaking of values or ideologies. And this is why symbolic design, I guess, is very important. And I think it's very foolish of the third wing to not have their own set of symbols that they can essentially procure and disseminate and create a culture around. Symbology is greatly important, and it does tend to convey ideas far easier than long books and texts. Like, think about it. You can look at a symbol and you know the gist of it, and you can embrace it or you can reject it, but you have to read a whole book to understand if you're going to reject or accept these ideas. That's something for the intellectually minded. That's not something for the general person that just wants to go along with their lives or just doesn't have time because they're working two shifts. It's no surprise that these ideas aren't really popular, aren't even espoused or known about by many of the normie workers in the world. It's no surprise, since there's no symbology in it, then how are they even going to be able to interact with these ideas at any level, at any speed? Instead, what I've noticed is that, and I have to study this a little bit more, but I suspect that this is the case, is that most revolutions are preceded by a generation of symbols, art, and most importantly, fashion. These three things are a direct result of self-expression of a set of ideas. There's this strange fetishization of the burqa, and I think that goes too far. But for example, in Slavic regions, what used to be the custom? The custom used to be that a woman who was unwed would grow out her hair and she would braid it. Once she was about to be married, the hair would be cut off, or the man would symbolically unbraid the hair. And generally women afterwards would wear a sort of chustka, it's called in Polish. It's a very nice embroidered little piece of cloth that would go over their heads and cover the hair. And in some regions, I believe in Iran, there's some pictures of it where it covers the face and the mouth as well. And of course, women wore dresses, etc. And this, I think, is a very healthy level of that kind of dichotomy. And especially in today's time, where you need to have pushback against pushback. But in general, when we notice that the left essentially starts the revolutions by liberalizing expression, and expression is essentially, or creating a new form of expression. This goes from haircuts. Many people will recognize the lesbian haircut, where women would shave half their head to symbolize that they're a lesbian. And this essentially let people see each other, and they would feel solidarity with each other, and they would already know the ideas that they're espousing, the general ideas, and it allowed these small little groups of people to form and find each other, and it made it much easier. And what we notice is that the left has been going through a liberalization process, and what one can call this really is a corporatization process of how people are clothed, a cosmopolitanization of clothing. People are dressed the same everywhere. Essentially, go from Eastern Europe into Western Europe, and especially, you know, the westernmost part of Eastern Europe, and you'll actually be hard-pressed to say that you're in Poland, except for, you know, the obvious things such as language. If you look at the people, you'd have to ask yourself, how is this different than Germany, except maybe that there's less immigrants here? You could be confused. If I switch out all the signs with German signs and people spoke German, you wouldn't actually know you were somewhere else. And I think that is a perfect example of how these revolutions change through these small little modes of expression. You go through changes in clothing, a little bit of change in symbology. You go through change in art. And it's this creep in these fields that then disseminates these ideas into the masses and infects them with it. And this is something the right has completely ignored. I mean, right-wing art and third-wing art is completely lacking. I'm hard-pressed to find any. I'm genuinely hard-pressed to find any, and any art that I do find is generally private art, and it's religious art, and I understand that, but we also need artists that are willing to essentially invade the liberal space with their own art. We need to find ways to absolutely invade the space, and there's a lot of room for that for us. Another thing we can do is something I've noticed with the burqa idea. Essentially, we call them kagańce in Poland, the masks. I think I have another free-falling on this one. And I also spoke about the solution in that one, where we can essentially create local trade and disseminate this idea of women should wear dresses to prevent themselves from COVID getting into them and making them infertile. And we can also sell the idea of resist, be a woman, not a slave, essentially, by giving women these chustki, which also cover their hair and cover their face, leaving only their eyes to be seen in a very traditional way. In Eastern Europe, I think this would be a much easier task than in Western Europe. But essentially, we use the onus of fear that is produced along the masks and COVID to generate an impulse into a very conservative way of dressing. The moment women put on and adorn these conservative dresses and these conservative way of expressing themselves, they will internally become more conservative in their narrative as well. And this is going along the idea that symbols, expression, etc. matter. And this is something we have to work on. We have to start dressing differently, speaking differently, producing music, everything. Essentially, we have to actually start living these ideas instead of just speaking about them. And I think that is our greatest downfalls. We have no way to actually start living these ideas. In fact, we're often afraid to start living these ideas because we hate to say it, but our ideas might be different, but we still conform to the same cosmopolitan system. How many people do you know would actually dress as a proper Englishman, combining folk styles with formal styles? How many Polish people do you know that would proudly go out in the żupan and kontusz into the streets? Very few, and most people probably look at them as if this was some sort of costume. Oh, it's a parade, oh, it's a joke, but no, it's real. You're expressing something. And at first they understand that you're expressing and they try to put it off as a joke, but soon they begin to realize that you're not actually just expressing something. You're expressing a very specific set of values and very real set of values. And the thing is, especially if we manage to get this sort of, chustka campaign going, and let's say it consumes about 40% of women. 40% of women see this is resistance, this is beautiful, I want to be this kind of woman. I don't want to be a slave, I want to be free, I want to be a strong Slavic Polish woman. And imagine 40% of women catch on to that. That is a landslide that is not going to stop. It will consume society eventually. And I feel that the left and the government would actually, seeing this happening, would rather create an even more intense restriction, which would even then increase the rate at which this kind of revolt goes on. Because let's face it, society is in constant revolt because we're in a democracy. Every so many years, there's a new revolution. But what ends up happening is you hit critical mass and the dominoes topple. And I feel like that the left, seeing this gaining speed, accelerating, would rather release their grip on society that they have with COVID than let it actually come to fruition. Because the moment everyone switches how they express themselves, ergo how they dress, is the moment everyone has changed the way they think into a very conservative way of thinking. And what comes with that, a very different sense of freedom. And in Polish, essentially in Polish we have two words, swoboda and wolność. Wolność is a very different word when it comes to swoboda, even though they mean the same, almost the same thing in the dictionary. They encompass very different ideas. And in English, you have liberty and freedom, and I think these two words essentially encompass the same thing. Well, similar ideas, but not exactly. You know what I'm trying to get at. That's mostly an off-topic discussion. However, the gist of it is, we have ideas are disseminated through expression. When expression changes, so does human behavior change. Human thinking change. And thus, the way to victory is to change your expression. And thus to disseminate these ideas properly through society. This is, of course, ignoring the lack of spirituality and spiritual depth within right-wing thinking and third-wing thinking as it stands. Sława. Have a good day. And God bless you. Szczęść Boże.